The paper is blank, but the eyes say it all, filled with rage. The humble sheet of A4 is today's banner of protest in China, left blank to get past the censor, but the censor can no longer keep up. This was a march in Beijing. The white paper movement is spreading. First, it was all about opposition to China's strict zero-COVID policy. Citizens, millions of them, yearning to escape almost 3 years of intermittent lockdowns. No more PCR tests, no more isolation, they shout in Beijing, and freedom! Freedom! We want freedom. But in recent days, the message has morphed, touching the rawest of political nerves. Down with Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, they shout in Shanghai, China's New York. Forbidden words on any street in this country for over 3 decades now, once almost certain to lead to arrest and imprisonment. But the police are outnumbered. They make only the occasional arrest. This was Ed Lawrence, a BBC journalist apprehended in Shanghai, released after only a few hours.
Hey, Barry, call the consulate now.
And the protests are spreading nationwide. This was Chengdu in Sichuan province. Down with Xi Jinping, down with the Communist Party, they shout here too. Protests with this message on such a scale are unheard of in a country where the state has perfected the use of surveillance and fear for social control. Which is why none of this explosive stuff featured on the evening news. Lead item, a piece about the launch of a Chinese spacecraft. Final item, COVID infections are rising, the government will prevail. A message echoed today by the Foreign Ministry spokesman.
We believe that with the leadership of China's Communist Party and the cooperation and support of all Chinese people, our fight against COVID-19 will be successful.
From the bland to the oblivious, President Xi cocooned inside the forbidden city of China's leadership, all masks and military pomp for the visiting Mongolian leader. How dangerous is this moment for Xi Jinping and the leadership of the Communist Party in China?
I think the stake is very, very high. We are talking about the opportunity, the prospect of Xi Jinping staying in power and Xi Jinping losing it. And I just don't see Xi Jinping accepting the possibility of losing power.
Xi's zero COVID policy was supposed to be one of his signature achievements, proof that China could organize where the West could not. A chilling case in point, one of the country's brand new COVID quarantine camps. China's had to lock down repeatedly because its homemade vaccine is not as effective as most of the ones used by the rest of the world. But Beijing won't license foreign mRNA vaccines like Pfizer. It all amounts to a deadly dose of Chinese vaccine patriotism. And only half of China's 32 million over 80-year-olds have been jabbed. Rampant COVID is almost certain to overwhelm the health system. So the authorities are caught between the virus and their people, locked in dream homes that have become prisons. What has died on the streets of China is the social contract at the heart of the regime. You make and spend money, but leave the politics to us. The politics has overreached, and the people have lost their fear to say so.
Well, joining me now is Dr. Yu Jie, a senior research fellow on China at Chatham House, the foreign affairs think tank. Are these protests really about COVID restrictions or about freedom in a greater sense?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I think the majority of the cities, as you can see, is more about very stringent COVID measure that people has endured in the past few months. Whereas on the other hand, you have seen a few dissidents over there is basically questioning about the regime itself. So it's a combination of both.
How surprised are you to see this?
I'm not surprised at all. I mean, to be honest, I mean, after 2.5 years, extreme stringent measures is imposed on the population. So naturally, there's a sense of frustration and anger when the end is in sight, and perhaps we don't really know the answer yet.
Do you see it growing then?
Well, I see a growing of sense of frustration, but I think given the people, the population has expressed the anger, And perhaps the party have to think about twice whether this zero COVID would really worthwhile to insisting on. Or, on the other hand, you may have some sense of slogan of zero COVID being put in place, but gradually loosening the measure as everyone was hoping for.
I mean, obviously, to most of us, the only time we have seen proper Chinese uprising is Tiananmen Square. Is this at all comparable?
I don't think it's comparable at all, to be honest. I think we're not really reaching that inflection point yet, because Tiananmen in the past is about inflation, is about seeking for democracy. Whereas on the other hand, in here, for many of the citizens in China, they speak out, is about their own economic future. It's less so about politics.
So this should be containable for President Xi?
Well, it's something that would be measurable if he decided to loosening the measure and taking more scientific approach.
But if he loosens the measure, doesn't he show that protest works?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it shows that people have spoken, and then the government, if they rightfully consider people's concern, the government should really come up with clear measures in here. You know, while we're talking about having maintained economic growth, well, at the same time for the health measure, he can't have both.
And if he does relax, COVID will go up. Can Chinese healthcare cope?
Well, we don't know. That's the thing. I think really up to two conditions we have in here. Firstly, what is the percentage of vaccination coverage for the most vulnerable? And secondly, whether the SU bed capacity for the state-funded hospital are sufficient to cope with the exit wave, like what we have experienced in this part of the world.
In this country, Rishi Sunak's about to give a speech talking about robust pragmatism towards China and other more authoritarian states. How will that go down?
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, there's something a bit ambivalent in here. On the one hand, UK want to keep the trade relationship with China, whereas on the other hand, UK still want to somehow getting close with these US allies. So he need to get his balance right to some extent.
Dr. Yu, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for joining us. Well, as we were just discussing, within the next hour, Rishi Sunak will give his first major foreign policy speech since he became Prime Minister, calling for a robust pragmatism towards China. He'll tell diplomats and business leaders in the City of London that short-termism or wishful thinking will not suffice. Well, not everyone agrees that that strategy is the right one, not least in his own party. Earlier, I spoke to the former Conservative leader, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. Sir Ian, what do you think of robust pragmatism when it comes to China?
Not much, actually, because I don't think it means anything. It's like a contradiction in terms. I don't quite know what we're supposed to take from that. I mean, if on the one hand you want to be robust with China, then why would they bother if at the same time you're trying to, as it were, do business with them? And they just see that as weakness. I think what the Prime Minister said during the summer was that he saw them as a systemic threat. And I expected that to be put into the integrated review, which puts Russia down as a threat, from which all other policy positions flow, instead of which we've got this really peculiar tautology, really, a contradiction in terms. No, not much.
Yeah, I mean, pragmatism is really, I mean, quite far away, as you say, from what Rishi Sunak said over the summer. And he's a political theorist. He studied this stuff. He knows that it means where there are no absolutes, where you compromise on principle. I mean, is that a starting point for any kind of British foreign policy?
Well, be honest with you, what are we seeing in China at the moment? Chinese people frustrated, worried, angry with their dictatorial, brutal government and complaining in the streets, even calling for President Xi, who is absolutely brutal, committing genocide in Western China amongst the Uyghur, slave labor, Tibetan incarceration, you name it, trashing the Sino-British agreement, arresting peaceful protesters, threatening Taiwan. I don't know what more you need as evidence that they now become a threat. But instead of which, as we watch all of this, we even see a BBC journalist being beaten up and dragged away from the protests. And on the very day we see all of that, the government comes out with its robust pragmatism, which I think to most people out there means kind of anything you want it to mean. And that sounds to me like getting pretty close to appeasement.
I mean, saying it's close to appeasement is obviously a very emotive phrase. Are you happy with that comparison, both in terms of them and us?
Well, I think I am, because I think for too long the free world has turned a blind eye to the abuses and the threats from China. I'm sanctioned by the Chinese government, so you could argue that I have a vested interest, but I'm sanctioned for calling out the genocide of the Uyghur. I'm sanctioned for calling out the threats and the arrests in Hong Kong. My family is threatened, and there are others here in Parliament and in the European Parliament and in Europe that are also sanctioned for doing the same thing as part of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which I set up. So yes, I think unless we are clear and robust, China will treat us as weak. And if they do that, they will do it because they think, therefore, we will end up appeasing them. And I just feel the road to appeasement we went through in the 1930s, if you learn any lesson at all, is the more you appease dictatorships that impose authority on their people and strip away human rights, the more you drift into dangerous waters. Be strong, engage, but be strong when you engage about what you don't approve of, absolutely, and make it clear from the word go.
Why would China care whether Britain took that stance or not? I mean, in economic terms, don't we need them more than they need us?
Well, here's the problem. We are dependent on them, and we don't need to be so dependent. There are many other countries we could be investing in, like India, etc., to develop these things, but we've become addicted to this idea of cheap labor. And a lot of it, as I've said earlier on, is slave labor. So what we need to be setting out is our belief that China itself poses a systemic threat to us, which is what the Prime Minister said. That percolates through all of our relationships with them. We don't subdivide one bit from the other. Why would China be concerned? They are concerned because they know the UK is close to the States, it's close to many of our allies in the Far East, it's also close to our European allies. And, you know, we are helping bolster the push for Ukraine. We can do the same when it comes to getting our allies to agree about China. China knows that. So what they're trying to do is to get us to lessen our position on them, which allows them, therefore, to say, there you go, the UK's okay, they don't treat us as an enemy or as a threat. If we treat them as a threat, that changes the terms of the debate for every other country as well.
Ian Duncan-Smith, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Well, tonight, Downing Street told us they are frank about the systematic challenges posed by China, but issues like climate change in Ukraine will need the involvement of all the world's major economies.